Good morning, and thank you for joining on time. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we get started. If you've got any questions throughout this session, please post them in the question and answer box, and we'll do our best to answer at the end. We've got a section for that. If we've got too many questions, we will, of course, look at getting those back to you within the next 24 hours. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to myself and to the rest of the panelists here for today's session, all around the Cyber Resiliency Bill and what it means to you and your organisations. I'm Cheryl Martin. I am the Group CISO and lead for cyber for C86. I've also been a member of the All-Party Consultation Committee for the Cyber Resiliency Bill. So I'm really excited to be here today to be discussing with you on the impacts of what that means to UK organisations. But also I'm joined by Christo and Dan, and we're going to talk about a broader view of what the Cyber Resiliency Bill means for you. Christo, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Yes, my name's Christo Konidaris. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Yo Messaging, and pleased to be with everybody today.
So, Dan?
Good. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Daniel Horvath. I'm the co-founder and senior penetration tester at Adversify.
Thanks, Dan, Pentester. If there's no question of a doubt in his title. So let's just introduce you to the topic of today. And for those of you who haven't, spent a lot of time diving into what the Cyber Resiliency Bill means, it was set up and announced in the King's Speech, and it is the Resiliency Bill, which is one of the most significant shifts in UK cyber regulation since we introduced NIS into the UK. It is enabling us in the UK to actually bring ourselves in line with the rest of the global organisations. It's a very close representative of NIS2, which is what's going through the European jurisdictions. And for many of our UK organisations, this new bill will bring in a number of gaps which they've not been used to being addressing. And they are both technical and operational. And there are a lot of obligations which need to be fulfilled. There were three objectives that the government brought in. The first was around its stance around the critical national infrastructure and bringing UK up into a view in the same alignment as the rest of the world. The second was around the regulatory focus and bringing it into a broader perspective. So there is more power to the ICO, and there will be also a view of what organisations like the service providers and data centres need to oblige for as well. Now, there's also a lot of welcome from the industry in that you were looking at the NCSC regulations and bringing in CAF. So it means that we become more of a European standard as well. So what we're going to look at today is, since this is going to be a bill which is likely to be passed at the back end of this year after it's moving through and it's in the House of Lords for review, what are the changes that the cybersecurity resiliency brings in practice? What organisations may be exposed to today and what they will need to look at and think about. Also, what a secure crisis communication plan might need to think about, which many organisations haven't considered. And a checklist which organisations can use to look at and start to dive. So let's just take a little bit of a view of some of those things which are maybe a bit surprising in this resiliency bill. There is a lot of terminology in there if you spent time looking at it. And there are also, if you're really interested, some data sheets which the government have produced, which enables organisations to actually get ahead of the curve and think about what needs to be done. Now, most of this comes down to actually providing the evidence and the obligations that organizations need to have. So that audit trail of what's happening within the organizations. So it's not just the audit trail, it's also the awareness throughout the organization, and then also the board responsibilities. So some of that is a significant change for many organizations. So there is a shift from providing reasonable security into provable resilience. And you're going to hear that throughout today's webinar. What does provable resilience mean for us as organizations, for the UK in general? Really, really critical is what's going to happen with near miss reporting. Now, if we were in the airline industry, we'd be very used to providing that near miss reporting. And I know Dan's going to talk about some of the things that happen within pen testing where we have that near miss. Phew, we're lucky we got away with that. But what does it mean? What does it mean for lessons learned for us as well? There's also a faster incident notification window. So 24 hours, unlike the 72 hours that we've got at the moment. And that's going to be, something which we'll need to think about in our own organizations and our operations. And the scope becomes expanded. If you think about the government's view, which is to ensure that UK PLC is protected, this scope is going to be expanded beyond the traditional national infrastructure services and sector into a much broader sector. So the questions that regulators are beginning to move forward to as well is no longer, were you attacked? And we've seen this time and time again, but can you demonstrate that you were prepared? So if we take away nothing else from today's session, is to think about what happens in that proactive stance. And that's why near miss, lessons learned, near miss supporting, mean time to adapt becomes things which are so critical to us as we're thinking about what we will need to do within the confines of the cybersecurity bill, but also how are we making sure that our own organizations are protected, are able to withstand what's happening within the organization, not only in the UK, but much broader as well. So there are a number of different organizations which become under the spotlight. And I mentioned a couple of them earlier before. So the MSPs, the data center providers. The aim is to protect the services which the public rely on. Now, there's no clearer view of an impact of the services that public rely on than what happened 12 months ago in Spain and Portugal, when their national power grids became unable to work for 24 hours, and absolutely everything in that critical national infrastructure within Spain and Portugal crashed. Mobile networks, power, water, all of those things. So this bill is to rise above and make sure that those services that the public rely on are there and can withstand in resiliency. As I mentioned, it's looking at that step change in that UK security, but more importantly, it's underpinning the UK economic stability. So there are 3 key areas in that readiness gap, and we're going to explore some of those today. The infrastructure, so the backup and resiliency, which Dan will look at and talk to. But if you take anything away from that, is how can you continue to operate when something happens? An instant response plan, and the plans we know are already in place, but sometimes under pressure, there are ways that they don't work. And Christo is going to deal with some of that as well. And then looking at that communication part as well. And often the communication is the weakest link. Now, I'm going to hand over to Christo, who is going to talk about some of the things around that communication gap and how some people have still not managed to fix that. Christo, over to you.
Cheryl, thank you so much. I'm really happy you mentioned aviation, being a keen pilot that I am, I always worry about near misses. Luckily, I haven't had one. But I think the part that I want to focus on is what you refer to as this communication gap. And I think what one needs to realize is these cyber attackers are very, very clever about their approach. And they really are looking closely at targeting, key aspects of IT infrastructure. So if one looked at some of the attacks that have happened, they go after things like Active Directory, email systems, identity management, things like MFA systems, collaboration platforms, even remote access platforms is what they're going after. So for the users, the typical symptoms are, staff can't log in, passwords stop working, email is unavailable, Teams and Slack is inaccessible, phones fail, and most importantly, there's no trusted instructions. This is the key issue. So this is where there has to be a consideration in those cyber resilience discussions around what is called an out-of-band communication platform. And really what we're talking about with an out-of-band communication platform is really establishing a way in which people can communicate with each other during that cyber attack and even after the cyber attack as sort of a shakedown to make sure that all the procedures have been followed and the capabilities have been put in place. So the key question is, what do we want to make sure is in this out-of-band communication platform? Well, as the name says, out-of-band, the first thing you want to make sure is that the communication platform doesn't sit within the existing infrastructure. It's actually external to the infrastructure that's already established. There's no point in putting an out-of-band communication platform on the same platform that your Teams or your Microsoft 365 is running on, because if that's affected, then it's going to get affected as far as the out-of-band communication platform is concerned. But the system needs to have a higher level of identity verification. So just using an email address alone as a mechanism to identify people and that they are the correct people is something that needs to be looked at when deciding on an out-of-band communication platform. And one can look at things like introducing biometrics as a mechanism to make sure that when you're actually sending those messages, you're sending it to a verified individual. Because during the cyber attack, that's critical because you don't want the attackers to understand what your game plan is to resolve the issue. Of course, really, really important is man-in-the-middle attacks. And this is where it's critical that this out-of-band communication platform has some form of encryption. What a lot of people don't realize is standard Teams and standard Slack, these platforms have no encryption in it. We've got used to encryption because we're using technologies like WhatsApp, Signal, and Telegram. But if you're really going to go for an out-of-band platform and you really want to protect those communications from a man-in-the-middle attack, it's critical that you have some kind of encryption enabled in the platform. Now, most of these platforms would come with some kind of administration panel. Generally, they're invite-only platforms, so you're inviting specific people. And again, another item to look at when considering an out-of-band communication platform is that that administration platform has a separate MFA capability. You could even, again, use biometrics as a mechanism, but you don't want anybody into the heart of your system. So you want to make sure that it's completely independent of your current communication platforms. And of course, there is some important elements that one needs to consider, which is how are you going to use this communication platform? And really what people will be looking at is using it not only for communication, but maybe to set up specific groups, maybe to set up call trees. So you must make sure the platform has that capability to make sure that you can create a structured communication platform. So if you think of it in traditional instant messaging platforms, you would like it to have, a phone capability, a video capability, and of course have the ability to set up the necessary groups. But bringing closer to the cybersecurity bill, what it calls out specifically is you need to be able to have an audit trail. So when you get down to that shakedown and you're having that discussion with the regulator, or you're having that discussion, hopefully not, but with the government, you have a record that shows how quickly you reacted, what your steps that you took, and you have a physical audit trail that you can represent to the people who are asking the questions, and you can get through that near miss situation by explaining exactly. So my last point on this really is really twofold. One of the key aspects of an out-of-band communication platform is the attack surface. So you want to make sure that this is not only a very secure platform, but you have control on who is invited to the platform. Because during that cyber attack, you want to make sure you have trusted individuals and nobody else can actually come into the system while you are communicating. So one of the things that a lot of out-of-band communications platforms do is they restrict access. And in our particular case, what we're doing is we're using an invite-only platform. And secondly, what one needs to consider, particularly in those environments where if you're talking about mobile technology or you're talking about desktops, these are generally locked down for that organization. So you might be in the situation where you have to rely on bring your own device kind of situation. And you need to make sure that that out-of-band communication platform has the ability to work, one, cross-platform, but it needs to be able to leverage things like the Play Store, the Apple Store, the Microsoft Store, and all of those things so that people can quickly implement the technology and get the product working, not necessarily on the work provided device, but maybe on a bring your own device scenario. So just to round off very quickly, I thought it would be interesting to just mention what could be some of the practical incident response workflows that one could consider. So the first thing is pre-incident preparation. You know, it's like when we fly a plane, Cheryl, we do a checklist and we make sure everything's in order and everything's going to be okay. The tanks are full of fuel and we can take off. That's the same sort of thing you would do with an out-of-band platform. You would pre-invite people, you would set up the call trees, you would set up all the necessary channels. Also, you would make sure that you have a capability to inform people when a cyber attack has been detected, and make sure that you can use the platform through that triage process that you're going through. And of course, it's all around containment and coordination. And finally, the last point in that workflow is really the recovery and the post-incident review. So I hope that gives you a good explanation of how we look at when providing this independent, if you like, messaging platform.
So thank you for that. And I think it's true to say that, you know, the awareness of what the Cyber Resiliency Bill means to a lot of organizations now, not just the critical national infrastructure providers. And, you know, that term out-of-bound communication would be very, very, you know, used a lot in critical national infrastructure providers. They're used to that. That's something which they've adopted for a long period of time to make sure they have that resiliency of their service, because they've been asked to, they need to, the regulators have been asking that. So, you know, Christo, what you've just outlined here is that pre-planning and that preparedness that all organisations in the UK should be thinking about as they come into and thinking about what the impact is to them as part of the Cyber Resiliency Bill. So, Dan, sort of turning this over to you, you know, we've heard what it means at the high level of the regulation, the impacts, the resiliency, what it means to think about some of that preparedness. What do we need to think about for how are we going to communicate? What are you seeing from some of that work that you are doing? And I know that you and your team are also CHEK certified. So for those of you who are listening to this, the CHEK certification is something that talks about being prepared and looks at what needs to be done in many of the regulated organizations. What's your advice to those that are on today and what the cyber resiliency bill means?
Yeah, brilliant. And a lot of the information that we've already shared it shares a lot of similarity with what we're seeing in the field, delivering penetration testing engagements. So usually when we're brought into organizations, it's usually for a mix. A lot of organizations are proactive. They're testing their resilience, validating their assumptions. They're doing all the right things. Other organizations come in after a scare of an incident, or like we were talking about before, that near miss. But interestingly, we tend to see the same patterns in both cases. Different sectors, different sizes, but the underlying issues are surprisingly consistent. The scale changes, but the underlying problems don't always. And from what we see, the biggest gap isn't usually sort of specific individual vulnerabilities. It's visibility. It's visibility across the organization's attack surface, and what that might look like. So from what we see, a lot of organizations don't fully understand their attack surface, their different attack surfaces, externally facing, internet facing, or within their own internal enterprise. They're securing what they know about a lot of the time, but quite often there's a disconnect between what they know about and what actually exists. So even when we speak to well-prepared organizations, when we sort of go through that penetration testing process, we often find things that weren't even on their radar. Now, that could be things as simple as, a system's been stood up for a project and it's just never been decommissioned. You've provided access to a system which has never been revisited. And because the organization has no visibility of that, it's not being actively managed or secured. And as we sort of shift towards the modern threat landscape, traditionally you would think of an attack surface as purely infrastructure. Now we're seeing the focus a lot on identity. So very similar to what Krista was talking about. Accounts, integrations, federated access, single sign-on, sort of all stitched together and interconnected across the business. And one of the key patterns that we see now when doing testing is really consistent. We see initial access, so some form of phishing, social engineering, weak credentials, identity compromise, and then an attacker or an adversary moving from that identity compromise to then look to control core systems. That might be things like Active Directory, Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, cloud systems. But once that sort of identity is compromised, everything sort of changes very quickly. And it's often a lot faster than people expect. Before anyone really knows what's happening, your traditional security and monitoring login are monitoring for that malicious behavior, but not necessarily malicious communications. So you're no longer kind of dealing with separate systems, traditionally sort of endpoint detection. The attack is now within your sort of organization's trust model. And at this point, it's not really about what they can access. It's about who they can be, what they can impersonate. And this is when you see that shift that moves beyond sort of traditional security testing into communications, because a lot of businesses these days rely heavily on platforms that Christo touched on earlier, like Microsoft Teams, Slack, Google Workspace. Everything that these businesses are coordinating are usually through these channels and are critical to kind of how they operate on a day-to-day basis. But the problem with that is they're usually tied to identity. So single sign-on is quite a common one. And if that identity is compromised, the platforms aren't just inaccessible, but they're completely untrustworthy. And that's the key issue. It's in an incident, it's not that just can you communicate, but how can you see and trust what you're seeing and hearing. So I'll just give you a run through a quick example of how this might play out in sort of a traditional penetration test. So when we're doing, let's say, an external penetration test, let's say we gain access to an organization's Microsoft 365, This is usually through something fairly standard, might be social engineering, weak credentials, man in the middle or adversary in the middle attacks, like Christo mentioned. Once we're inside, the technical side almost becomes a little bit less important, because the interesting part is what happens to the organization's ability to respond, because you have security teams that are trying to coordinate, but using platforms they can't fully trust. So every decision that they have to make takes longer. And additionally, when we discussed leadership earlier, they're often communicating through the same channels. So how can they have full confidence in what they're seeing? How can they coordinate that response? How can they manage it? How can they look to do that reporting that the cybersecurity resilience bill is bringing in? And no one really knows what's been affected, what's going down, what's causing slowdowns, because every decision, almost now has a question mark attached to it, which is an operational failure at this point. The operation can't operate effectively, and if nothing's down, even if nothing's fully down, that coordination is starting to degrade, and that's where a lot of real impact is felt. It's how those technical vulnerabilities are leveraged and what impact that has on the organization when your communication channels are affected. So, one of the questions that always comes out when we're talking to organizations, when we're speaking to organizations off the back of a penetration test is, if an adversary took down sort of all your primary systems, how would you coordinate your response? What would you use? Who would you trust? And it all kind of falls back to, some of the things you can implement around sort of out of band communications and trusted communications. And to be honest, a lot of the time, organizations, aren't completely sure. And, it's one of those things that, we probably don't talk about it enough in terms of how we coordinate that response. We talk about making incident response plans. We talk about patching. We talk about hardening. We talk about, attack surface management. But often, communications aren't always at the top of the list. So, those incident response plans, the plans often assume that everything's available and trustworthy, but when someone's inside, that assumption doesn't always hold. So essentially, I'm just going to talk about a couple of good things that you can do in your organization, and from what we've seen, in the field, and that the organizations that are further ahead in this, they think about things slightly differently. They assume some level of compromise. At some point, something's going to get compromised, something's going to go wrong, and you need to be prepared for what happens. They're not relying on everything going right. They're prepared for when it doesn't, and they don't assume perfect conditions. They also have a much clearer understanding of what actually exists in their environment. So when we're talking about that attack surface, so not just what's documented, but what's exposed, it's talking about being necessary in your exposure. Document everything with business justification, back everything up with clear rationale, and start to make those plans that if, whatever we have exposed is compromised, we have a plan off the back of that. They don't rely entirely on their primary identity systems for crisis communications. They have fallback channels that are agreed in advance, even with, leadership, senior members of the team. And then most importantly, they've actually tested them, because one of the things that you spoke about quite earlier was sort of validating assumptions. One of the biggest reasons that organizations should be performing penetration testing is largely because we want to move away from an assumption or an expectation, and we want to bring that into the reality. What do we think is going to happen, what should happen, and what is happening, and that's where pen testing can really sort of come into its own. But yeah, from what we see in the field, it's still rather the exception than the norm. But hopefully, that only improves with time and the new bill coming through. But no, thank you very much, Cheryl.
Dan, thank you for that. And I think some of these things which you are talking about, again, if I look back into critical national infrastructure or other, regulated organizations, people have been used to doing this time and time again. If we look at the 0-day report that talks about where vulnerabilities are when they're exposed to how they're being exploited, that's now moved into under a day. But we are seeing things reported in a much quicker point. If you look at what the Cyber Resiliency Bill is trying to bring into play, it is about that preparedness for organizations. And I think, there are things which we should be thinking about ourselves, and those no regret moves. So, Dan, you've talked about assume everything is going to go wrong. So that worst case scenario. Particularly looking at strengthening that supply chain. So, we've talked about what happens in your own organization, but what happens in your broader supply chain? If you're part of the financial world, you'll be very used to the FCA and the PRA view about that supply chain auditing. Here, we are talking about what does that mean in a broader perspective? Look at that incident response, as you said, Dan, and make sure you are testing it. And again, the regulation hasn't been down to everyone and every organization for that testing. So if you are part of a supply chain where an organization perhaps is NIST, has NIST requirements, or even DORA requirements if you're part of the financial services and you're, actually supplying out into Europe, that under DORA requirements, you need to look at that testing. You need to do that incident response. You need to do that penetration testing as well, and that proactive view. So thinking about things in that proactive way. If you're looking at your action plan for the next 30 days, and if you take something away from today's session, I think there are 3 things which I'd encourage you to think about as you go and think about what the cybersecurity bill will mean to you and to your organization. So the first is, the board awareness. Do your board and those execs understand what their role will need to become and the obligations that they have under the Cybersecurity Resiliency Bill? What is your company's understanding of resiliency? And that comes into, as Christo's talked about, that out-of-bound communication, as Dan's talked about that penetration testing and that vulnerabilities that you might have and who can you trust? And then how will you continue to refine that from those near misses or the activities that are happening or what's happening in the sectors as well? Defining what resiliency means to you. Is it still under that mean time to detect, mean time to respond, and that resilience view? Or are you moving in the same way that JP Morgan Chase are and others into that mean time to adapt? So how are you pivoting when something occurs and you have to do that adaptation? And what does that mean for your organization? And then, testing your near misses, your lessons learned, the threats that your organizations are under, and looking at that audit trail to understand how that audit trail will mean for you and what you need to do to move things. And is that something which the regulators will accept? So bringing on that view of, is it sufficient that I have an incident response plan that's on the shelf, and maybe I haven't pulled off and dusted off, which, Dan, I know you're smiling. I've certainly seen in many times when you've been in with an organization, you say, where's the incident plan? Oh, it's on the shelf there. We haven't taken that down. Because in the heat of the moment, you're just trying to contain everything.
Exactly.
I think, understanding, as both Christo and Dan have said, do you have a secure means of communication? So, there are certainly lots to think about as we look at what these changes are and what we think about in the Cyber Resiliency Bill. I'd like to invite questions from the audience. If you want to type those in, then that would be great. We have got a couple that have already come in. So if you've got some questions now, that's the end of our sort of formal part. And this is over to you to pose those questions. So remember, just pop them into the chat. We'll be able to see what's there and we can answer those as well. I think, Dan, we've actually got one for you. So the first one we've got here, which says, when you're undertaking, this testing at large organizations, how easy is it to move through that testing or move faster if you need to actually provide some of those results?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we're doing testing at large, for large organizations, quite often once we gain initial access, it's quite easy, because like we were saying before, a lot of the organization, a lot of the core is tied to identity. So a lot of the time is, when you get valid access, through valid accounts, employees, staff, that then they're not trained to treat their internal communications as potentially hostile. So an adversary who breaks through, can easily impersonate, perform social engineering attacks. Can really go to town, because it's just not something that a lot are prepared for. So once we get in, it's quite easy and quite scary, and a lot of the time it's a big blind spot. So if there's anything to sort of take away from that, it's even just encouraging good practices across your communications channels. So even if an adversary does come through, employees are vigilant on sharing credentials, particularly over Teams, over Slack. So we try to discourage sharing files, particularly sensitive documents within the organization, and adopt encryption first. And really try to enforce a kind of sort of security sort of challenge first mindset, similar to how we treat physical security. But it is very difficult.
Thanks, Dan. Christo, we've got one for you. So the question here is, would encryption go far enough when you look at that cyber resiliency bill? And sort of leading on to that as well, how easy is it to set up that out-of-band communication platform that you were talking about?
Yeah, sure. So to talk firstly about the encryption. So, when one thinks about out-of-band communication, generally where an out-of-band platform will start is something like on a mobile phone, as an example. And when I gave the example about bring your own device situation, you're now dealing with a non-trusted device. So encryption is really about protecting the communication between device A and device B and stopping that middleman attack. But what's also important is, as Dan mentioned in the pen testing, is identity is an important piece of the puzzle. So you need to make sure that the device on both ends is actually a trusted device. So that's the key element here, is encryption. Absolutely, you want to stop the man in the middle attack, so it's a requirement, but it's not the only requirement to create that secure communication platform. You've also got to make sure you've got the identity of the person. And that's where things like biometrics can play a role in making sure that you actually are dealing with a person and not a device. Because the moment you're just dealing with a device, you're opening yourself up for another attack. On your second part of the question, Cheryl, was really around how easy is it to set up an out-of-band communication platform. So firstly, these technologies, how they're built is, from the user perspective, it's pretty straightforward in that it's just like installing a WhatsApp or a Signal or a Telegram. So they can leverage, the Play Store or the Apple Store. And then on the desktop side, it's the same on the Windows Store and the same on the Mac Store. So from the application perspective, it's relatively easy to set it up and get it running. And literally, you're talking minutes, you're not talking days to try and do this. On the side of the server side of the technology, you have a number of options. They can run in a cloud platform. So maybe if your company's on Azure, you might want to consider putting this on AWS or maybe putting it onto a GCP as an example, on a different environment. So you'd have to get over the hurdles of understanding those cloud platforms. And then you obviously install our platform, taking into consideration the redundancy, the resilience that you would need on the back end. The only other real consideration really is the final step, which is actually the setup. So you want to make sure that you've created the right people to come to the platform, so invited the right people, and then you've actually set up those various groups. So you might want one for supply chain, you mentioned, Cheryl. On Dan's side, you might want a dedicated group on the IT side, specifically around IT security. And then you might want like a C-level group, and that C-level group is going to be the people that are really going to be trying to manage through this process of the cyber attack. Again, under the cybersecurity bill, there's a requirement in there that you have to inform various authorities, but also you have to build a plan to really inform your suppliers as well as your customers. And this, of course, is another element where how you strategize and get that sorted out is really important. I'll just end off by saying one of the most important things that companies have to manage during a cyber attack is the reputational damage. You know, one has to just think of the big corporates that have been affected. I mean, our own beautiful NHS, they had to cancel 190,000 appointments, stop surgeries. It was chaotic. So it's about how you manage that. And again, that's where this communication, out-of-band communication, becomes a very important element.
Perfect. And you have led really nicely into a question that Alistair has asked us. Just to read out, in what way do the panel believe that the bill will reduce costs to the business in the long run? And will it change the way that testing is done? I think if we, link off from what you've just said there, Christo, if we look at some of the highly publicised incidents that we've seen, Jaguar Land Rover is a good example, brings into what Dan was saying with compromised identities and that trust, impacts to the business now, and the cost of major cybersecurity incidents is steadily rising. If you look at some of the data that's out there, the average cost is nearly $5 million per incident. Now, we know Jaguar Land Rover was much higher. Christo, you've just talked about the NHS. So what do we believe that the bill will do in the cost to the business? It's just raising that awareness of the business of what it needs to do in the incident and that regular testing. Again, if you think about that supply chain, if you think about understanding where those vulnerabilities are in your organization and whether you are addressing them or not, that's one of the critical things that happens. And, Alistair, I think your second part of the question, will it change the way that testing is done? I absolutely believe it will change the thought process into more of that threat-led, near-miss type view of what has happened to other organizations. What can it happen to me in my organization, my supply chain, the way I need to work, and what I do with my incident management. And just before I hand it over to Dan and to Christo, if we were financial services organizations, and I know we've got a couple of financial services organizations on the call today, but if we were a financial services organization, we would be testing those near misses or those activities or those impacts in our critical environment. That's exactly what this bill is looking to do, and to bring down into a number of the other parts of the organization, so that where the UK public is dealing with us, we have that resiliency. Dan and Christo, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Yeah, absolutely, and thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, it's a really, really great question, Alistair. And yeah, I think it will sort of change the way pen testing, is done going forwards, and in a good way. Penetration testing, it is still delivered quite traditionally, sort of infrastructure, web application, and whereas attackers and adversaries have kind of evolved to kind of the modern threat landscape where you've got identity, cloud, and interconnected sort of ecosystems of that forms a complex organization's attack surface. Now, so penetration testing in general needs to, like Cheryl said, take almost that threat-led modern approach where, we're looking at holistically at that whole attack surface. We're testing, incident response playbooks. We're testing, so we likely see a rise in sort of what we like to call purple team engagements, which are collaborative engagements between a security operations center and a penetration testing team to check that these controls and these detections are working and find gaps in these policies. I'd like to think that assumed compromise testing, playing out specific scenarios within businesses to look at how they're currently reacting and look at any gaps in that process, are coming to light. So no, I think it will be a positive change, and I think penetration testing is definitely become more important part of that that puzzle and that picture. Yeah.
Yeah, what I would say to the question that was posed. So, the first thing is, will the bill actually reduce costs? And I think it will. And the reason is I say this is because these cyber attacks are one, becoming more sophisticated. So therefore we need to be more prepared. But more importantly, some of these cyber attacks are actually state-sponsored cyber attacks, which we're seeing more and more of. So the reality is the intention of the cyber attack is not necessarily a ransomware or a ransom. What the intention is to disrupt the business. So what the bill does is it forces companies, I believe, to be better prepared so that they can react to these state-sponsored type of attacks and put themselves in a position where they can react quicker. The other thing that I think it does, which is really important, is, as Cheryl spoke about, one of the key concerns is core infrastructure, telephones, water companies, nuclear providers, this kind of stuff. So by having the cybersecurity resilience bill in place, ultimately it'll save cost in that essentially, one, we're measuring what's happening because you have to report. This is one of the things that is definitely in that cybersecurity bill. And you have to report quite timely. I think, if I remember correctly, the last iteration I read was within 72 hours. I've heard other people say 24.
24.
Yeah, so it varies, but
24. Yeah,
24.
exactly.
So it's also quite a high bar. One, identify, am I in a cyber attack, and then you've got to report. So I think on the cost side, initially there'll be cost to the business, but it will protect the business, and therefore you'll save money. And again, circling back, probably the biggest cost to any business that's out there is the reputational damage. Losing customers.
Absolutely. And there's another message which sort of again links onto that. It's asking us as the panel that in our experience here, we've seen the financial organizations prepared for this sort of testing. Do we believe that both the financial organizations and other areas are prepared for this tighter regulation? And I think, Christo, you've just answered some of that as well. Looking at being able to get ourselves ready as UK PLC is so important and so critical that yes, we are going to have to take leaves out of the financial institutions. It might mean that, as you said, Christo, in the short term, that there will be a slightly increased cost to the business as that regulation is set up, that way of working is set up, that testing is done. But maybe in that longer term, that reputational element and being prepared is something which will outweigh those costs as well. So being able to be, actually in and supporting and complying with the cyber resiliency bill is something which, we will need to think about. I think on the other side, and just before I hand over to Dan and Christo, for those who have spent time in looking at this, there are concerns that currently at the moment that there are shortages of the right level of people that will be able to work on this, from not only from the organizational side, but also from the ICO that will become the regulator, and that will need to be a lot more work in there. So again, just thinking back into your own organization, the couple of things that we've said is, how ready are you? Do you have access either in your own organization or externally to others of, VCSOs or support that can help you bring you into that particular level that you need to be? So you're just getting yourselves into that, supply ready, support ready, the no regret moves that I talked about earlier, and strengthening that board awareness and the awareness of everyone in the organisation is really critical. Dan and Christo, anything to add to that?
I think you did a good job, Cheryl. Well done.
And as if by magic, Steve has posed a question here, and he said this has been really superb to listen to. Maybe working with a financial organisation soon, I'd like to be able to listen to this podcast again, and if possible, what's the best link to review this? As all the things that have been said by the panelists here are so logical yet often overlooked. Steve, the check is in the post. Thank you very much for that. We will be sending out to you at the end of this demo, probably after about 2 o'clock UK time, the summary, a link for you to come and look at this time and time again. We have created, as the panelists, a 10 checkpoint list for you that will come out as well. So you'll have that as a takeaway. There is also, a view of coming down into looking at where are you ready. So from the C86 perspective, you were looking at that readiness assessment, working very closely with Dan and the penetration testing team to test your environment. And then I know Christo is very keen to look at and follow up as to where the Yo messaging platform could help you with that out of bound communication. So, today we've looked at what the cybersecurity resiliency bill would mean. Alistair has just popped in. Are all the panelists on LinkedIn? Yes, we are. We're happy to share our LinkedIn details. We'll get that added also onto the summary that comes up, so you can come and stalk us and find out, and we'll be more than delighted to work with you. So we will, as I say, send out to you an email which summarizes this with our 10 points of things that you should think about. If and when I was thinking about today and looking at what does that mean for all of us, I would say, if you take nothing else from today as some of those lessons learned, look at that for you and your organization. Resiliency is no longer defined by whether you recover, because we know that we will recover. It's defined by whether you remain in control in the incident. And Dan's view about taking on that proactive purple team testing and going into a safe space and a safe environment, and understanding what that means in that moment of crisis is so critical. So no regrets moves. Make sure your board and everyone is aware. Look at that testing that you can do. Define what it means for your company's understanding of resiliency, and absolutely think about what it means for that communication and that trusted communication. Simon, last minute question. No, apologies if I missed, but when will the law hit the statute book? We're expecting it to be at the end of this year. It's just in the House of Lords and going through. It will come into statute. What we will do for all of you who have registered here as well, we'll make sure we'll keep you updated with what's happening as it's going through the policy process. We know it's coming. It's not a question of if, it's when. So let us get ahead of that curve, take the leaves out of the books of some of the other organisations in different jurisdictions who actually are doing this now proactively, and make sure that we are not exposed as UK organisations as well. Dan and Christo, anything you'd like to say just in a very quick wrap up?
All good from my side.
Oh,
Perfect.
sorry, Christo. I was just going to add on as well. You know, for all those organisations who are currently doing penetration testing, you know, when it comes around to your next penetration test, whether you do it annually, biannually, or more regularly, I'll always say have a look at that scope. Have a look, is the current scope, you know, covering everything you need in your organisation? Is it hitting your attack surface where you need it to be? You know, do you feel confident in the outcomes from your penetration testing? And even, you know, if it's applicable, you know, challenge that scope. Always keep thinking about, you know, what do we assume and what's that reality? You know, what's going to go wrong if something happens here? And you know, and that's just you know, my advice in order to get the best out of, you know, every penetration test you do, sort of thing. But no, thank you, Cheryl.
Absolutely. Don't just go through the ropes of doing a penetration testing. It can be so useful. And think about, you know, what you want to demonstrate into the board as well. I'd just like to thank you all for your attention throughout today's webinar. If you have any questions, you think of anything else, as Alistair, you said, you want us to come in on LinkedIn, we'll be more than happy to follow up. For us, this has been a great way of thinking about what the Cyber Resiliency Bill means to the UK. We want to get it out there in front of as many people of the impacts of what people need to be thinking about, so they're not left behind. Many of us remember the scrabble to become GDPR compliant those years ago, and this for us is trying to take that proactive view as well. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the next one of these, where I'm sure we'll be unpicking in a lot more detail some of those areas around what the impacts are and what businesses have learnt. But Christo and Dan, my fellow panelists, I'd like to thank you for everything, and for everyone behind the scenes who's made today absolutely possible. So brilliant, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.